Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on history of leaders of thought. Today we will be doing Averroes and Thomas Aquinas, respectively. So, starting off with Averroes. So, Averroes is referred to as the commentator for his notable works commenting on Aristotle and a little bit of Plato as well. He's also the founder of Averroism, obviously, hence his name. And he's also known for being the discoverer of the retina and its purpose, so very important in terms of healthcare. He's also very commonly referred to as Ibn Rushd, which means son of Rushd, but in fact it was actually his grandfather who was named Rushd. So to get into a brief history of his life, his full name is Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmed ibn Rushd, also sometimes added on the end al-Hafid, which means the younger. So Rushd was his grandfather, who was a very, very famous individual in the town he was born in, known as Cordoba, which is in modern-day Spain, but at the time it was part of Islamic Empire. So his grandfather was the chief judge of Cordoba, but also an imam of the great mosque of Cordoba. So a pretty influential figure both in the political sphere, but also in the religious sphere as well. Similarly, his father also, for a small period of time during a certain government, was also the chief judge of the town. So his education was supposedly excellent in that he had trained in Ladith, which is the learnings of the rituals of Prophet Muhammad. He learned fiqh, which is Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic legal systems, and he also studied medicine, theology, philosophers, and poets, and some philosophy and poetry in Seville. In Seville he actually met Abu Yusuf Yaqub, who becomes a very important figure in his life. But growing up, I think something to note is that he was always more fascinated in law than he was in religion. So that's something that's going to be pretty important also when we get into the comparison as well. He's also known to be an important, very fascinated in the ancients. When we say the ancients, we're always referring to the Greeks. So I think this is a very common factor. I don't think anyone after the Greeks who didn't study the Greeks, I can't think of any philosopher who hadn't studied the Greeks that calls themselves a philosopher. So he's known for his influence on philosophy, theology, medicine, astronomy, physics, Islamic jurisprudence, and linguistics. He ultimately ends up becoming the judge of Supreme Court judge, court physician for an Alaman Caliph. His family was very powerful, but he was so it was pretty much a defined path for him. At 40 years old, he also ultimately becomes becomes employed by Abu Yaqub Yusuf, who becomes the caliph, and is ultimately the patron and commissioner for many of his works and commentaries, particularly those related to Aristotle. At 58, he gets exiled to an island called Lucina, and this is after Abu Yusuf Yaqub died. But eventually he comes back into favor, and eventually, after a small period of time, dies in Marrakesh. He's most known for vehemently opposing Neoplatonism. So Neoplatonism had been very powerful because, if you'd seen the previous video, Al-Farabi and Avicenna had been pushing for Neoplatonism, and they had been bringing it to the east. Technically, in this case, Averroes is actually in the west, far west in Spain, but it's still Eastern in that it was many strong Middle Eastern influences such as Islam. So either way, Neoplatonism was getting very popular, and Averroes was known for, or famous for, pushing to bring back Aristotelianism. Similarly, at this time, Asharhi, which is a Sunni theological school, argued against the incorporation of philosophy. They thought that the Quran is sufficient and there is no need to include the philosophers. But his argument here, and just to, I guess, start off strong, is that truth cannot contradict truth. So he thought that they're both two ways of achieving an end, and just because they might contradict each other doesn't mean that you can't have the two. They're not mutually exclusive. And he actually also wrote this book called Bidiyat al-Mujahid, which outlines the differences between different Islamic-based legal systems. So I'm just going to actually change my fan. Sorry about that. I hope you're, in terms of medicine, very important influences there, in that he found a new theory of what causes a stroke, and that he observed that it was a problem with the artery sending blood to the brain, which is partially true. It's not the absolute cause of it, but it is an important component, and probably proved that he must have been doing some surgeries or been in the involvement sort of in the interworkings of the body. He was also the first to discover the retina, as I mentioned earlier, but he also was the first to observe the symptoms of Parkinson's, but he gave it no name. But it would be interesting if, we could have had a world where we have Averroes' disease, which was Parkinson's. So if he had given it a name, maybe that would have been the case. So he's more popular in the West overall than he is in the East, just because in the East he's seen as kind of one as, well, he's just considered more of a Westerner, whereas but even then in the West he's still considered a controversial figure. He's condemned by the Catholic Church, particularly one of his ideas, which is the unity of intellect, in which he believes all human minds have equal capacities. That's also been given a lot of criticism. But nonetheless, so after his excellent, they specifically say excellent, quote-unquote, education, at 17 he goes to Marrakesh, to the capital, actually, of the Almohad Caliphate at the time. So he's sent to build a new college. At 17, I don't think he was really building a new college, but he started astronomical observations. So that was sort of the first thing he wanted to pursue. He was trying to look for physical laws rather than mathematical laws, but he ultimately failed in this, and he has this quote here: "The astronomy of our time offers no truth, but only agrees with calculations and not with what exists." So he never really made that much of an astronomical career of himself, or I guess, to use a pun, an astronomically successful career, or it wasn't, rather. Eventually his friend Ibn Tufail introduces him to Abu Yusuf Yaqub, who actually, they had been Seville at the same time, but they didn't meet at that time, but eventually he gets introduced to him, and so Abu Yusuf Yaqub was to become the caliphate of the caliph, or the caliph of the caliphate, pardon. So they start this discussion, and Abu Yusuf Yaqub asks him, did the universe exist forever, or was it created, and was there a start to it? So Averroes actually at this point didn't have an answer. He ultimately does have an answer, which I'll explain to you later. But he doesn't respond, so he just sort of sits there and lets the other two do their talking, his friend and the caliph. So ultimately they go into the topic of Aristotle and Plato, and then he chooses to jump in and proves himself to be very intellectual. So they're both mutually respect each other. He actually says of the caliph, his profuseness of learning he did not expect. So he did not expect a leader or someone who is by birthright to get powerful to be so educated. And this, I think, would be a good example of the philosophical leader that Plato alludes to. But I think also this is a testament to Averroes' modesty, in that he did not try talking about something he did not have an answer to. So he did not try saying, the thing is, it's an easy question to answer because it's binary. Did the universe exist forever, or did it not? But to come up with a smart answer, he could have easily embarrassed himself, but he was prudent in not coming up with some fake or weak answer. So at this, Abu Yusuf Yaqub was having difficulties understanding Aristotle, so he asked and commissioned Averroes to start writing commentaries on him, and with great success, and many of them are still read today. And with this, he gets the job of a qadi, as a judge in Seville. So he at a place he had previously been to. Soon after, he gets a judge role in Cordoba, in his hometown. So, and very much following the footsteps of his grandfather and father. And he gave what's called fatwas, legal opinions, and predominantly based on Sharia, or Islamic laws. He eventually succeeded Ibn Tufayl as court physician, so that was the individual who introduced him to Abu Yusuf Yaqub, so he probably also got him into medicine as well, so very helpful individual in his life. He eventually becomes the chief Qadi of Cordoba, the chief judge, which is the role his grandfather and father had held, but ultimately, after spending some time in this role, Abu Yusuf Yaqub dies, and he actually did spend a little, Averroes spent some time as the court physician as well, which is like the top physician role. But anyways, he died and he fell out of favor. Averroes fell out of favor and he has to get banished to Lucena. Some say this is solely for political reasons. Some say perhaps Averroes was slandering the new government, or some say that just generally the political landscape was moving to a more conservative, more strict to the book form of Orthodox Islam, which obviously rejected the thoughts of Aristotle and philosophical thinkers. So there are obviously many of these reasons. What do I personally think? I think he probably did some slandering. I think he at this point he was strong enough in his career that he could do so. But I think it was predominantly political reasons that he got sent over. So, in terms of what he wrote at least 67 original works, 28 on philosophy, 28 on medicine, 8 on law, 5 on theology, 4 on grammar. And I think that's interesting because that's almost exactly how his interests go. As I alluded to earlier, he was more fascinated in law than he was in theology, but he wrote the most by far in philosophy, so that was his real true passion. Whereas grammar, not so interested in that. And he also wrote commentaries on Aristotle, as mentioned, and he pretty much wrote only on Aristotle. The only one exception was that he wrote on Plato's Republic, just because he did not have access to Aristotle's equivalent, which I find surprising in that, he was working for the Caliph, the leader of the Caliphate, and he couldn't get access to that book. I thought that was a little strange, but nonetheless, so I guess we'll talk about the philosophy. So, getting into the heavy stuff. So he obviously supported Aristotle over Neoplatonism. So he's actually almost going to step back. So Al-Farabi and Avicenna were pushing for Neoplatonism. He thought that the two could not be synthesized. They were directly contradicted each other. So it couldn't be that Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism could coexist. He thought that Aristotelianism had to succeed. He thought that Avicenna said that existence is created by the combination of accident and essence. So accident and essence creates existence. But he thought it was exactly the opposite, in that existence exists per se, and then one can derive the accident and essence, or one can derive the components. So pretty much just two opposite ideas. What do I think is correct? Well, it's kind of just it's chicken and egg argument. Does the thing exist first, or do I think that both simultaneously exist personally? But I think that Averroes thought this was a sufficient point to create a debate and a sufficient reason to discredit both Neoplatonism and Avicenna. In terms of Al-Farabi, the other individual who I have also discussed, he thought that they both discussed logic, but Al-Farabi predominantly agreed with almost everything Aristotle said, but he made some changes, and Averroes said that all the changes that he made were completely wrong and Aristotle was right in every regards. Moving to the Sunni argument, so the Sunnis were attacking the Western philosophies, particularly Aristotle and Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism was getting a lot of popularity at the time, but he thought that there were two ways of approaching truth, and he thought that they could both coexist, which I find a little bit ironic, because he thought that Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism could not coexist, but he thought that Islam and Aristotelianism could coexist. So I think it's weird that he had such a double standard in that regards, in terms of the nature of God. So he thought that there wasn't a cosmological God, as Aristotle thought, but a teleological. So to prove God, he uses the providence argument, and that he observed the world seems, the temperature is pretty good, there's an abundance of food. It seems as though the world must have been created for man. And I think it's a reasonable argument. He gives attributes to God. So in some of the previous videos, they thought even to give a characteristic to God would be to misrepresent him. So you couldn't describe him in any ways, but he goes completely the opposite in this regards. He says that he has divine knowledge, life, power, will, healing, and speech. So a couple things here. First, he thought it's impossible not for him to have this, because he's omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. So he must have all these things. But specifically, for example, speech. He said divine knowledge. He must have divine knowledge. But to have divine knowledge, he must have speech. So he thought these things were true. So he's kind of going contrary and actually giving God specific characteristics. Going to the pre-eternity of the universe argument. So that original question that the Caliphate, Abu Yusuf Yaqub, posed to him, he thought that he does not discount philosophy of the Quran that created the in time. So he thought that, sure, the universe was created in time, but if you extract the component of time, the universe has always existed. So this is an extremely profound thought, removing the component of time. Some of our past thinkers actually had done it. Interesting enough, some of our earliest Greeks had thought about abstracting away from time, but hadn't really, after this, been really fully understood until relativity and Einstein, quantum mechanics, and quantum physics. But I think that's a good answer, because if he had given that answer to Abu Yusuf Yaqub in that first interaction, obviously it would have been good, but maybe it would have come across as too cocky. So maybe he also had that answer all along. In terms of politics, he believed in Sharia law, but he also believed in Plato's philosophical king. So Al-Farabi also believed in this and thought that the Caliph was a good example of that. And I think Abu Yusuf Yaqub would be a good example of this philosophical king, because he was very well read and very intelligent. Another thing in terms of politics is he actually, and not only contrary to Western, but also particularly contrary to East, he believed that women should be included in all facets of society, that being through government all the way to intellectuals, to any form of art. And he actually regretted a lot of Islamic history for not only not doing what was best for the women, but doing for the best well-being of the entire state. So this is something that even today the world has not fully come to grips with, and it's interesting that this individual was so forward-looking in that regards. In terms of natural philosophy, so in terms of astronomy, as mentioned, he was relatively a failure here. There's the Ptolemaic system, which observed that there are ellipses around planets. So not an eclipse, which is where the sun crosses over the moon or vice versa. But he believed that there ellipses are. He thought it had to be perfect. He believed there were perfect circles, and he thought the math was just wrong. So this goes back to this point: the calculations were wrong, but he thought there must be a proper explanation that they're just missing. But he was wrong there. There are ellipses, even in the heliocentric model. So he observed that there were three types of motion. There's observable motion, there's instrumental motion, and philosophical motion. So observable motion is like you see the ball rolling. Instrumental motion is like you push the ball or hit the ball with a stick or something. Philosophical motion, I think he's getting at is relativity once again here. Like if you move the head, it's philosophical motion. So that's what I believe there. He thought that the differences in the moon's color had to do with the differences in the moon's thickness. So that was obviously quite wrong. But European scholastics, up until Galileo, thought even the sunspots had to do something to do with the thickness as well. So just because he was wrong doesn't mean many people way after him still got this wrong as well. He actually supported Aristotle's spherical Earth, so it was pretty much generally believed now, but once again, emphasizing his love for Aristotle, but something in this regards that he actually got right. So, in terms of psychology, he had what's called the Long Commentary, which was actually his last commentary, and this is where he starts speaking of the unity of intellect, which he thought all brains have equal intellect. I think a good other argument for this would be, well, he thought that all brains are pretty much equal, but sometimes senses might cause you to go in different ways. Like if you're in a music hall, you're gonna get your music brain going. And I think another good argument for this would be the 10% of the brain. You know, there's just so many different regions. But I think it is wrong in that some brains are better than others in different fields. But it's hard to say exactly what he meant by this. But he got a lot of criticism with this, particularly in that it discounts a lot of, you know, divine right of kings or anything like that. So it had a lot of problems, caused a lot of debate. But I think it was very, very well intentioned and very humble of him as well, in that, you know, he had a brilliant brain. He was one of the most famous people all around, and he said that, oh, my brain is actually equal to yours. It would have been one thing if it was like a bottom feeder who said all our brains are equal, but to come from the top, it actually carries a lot more weight. And I think it's also true in that all brains are worth the same, in that all humans, you know, before the law or before any divine judgment are equal. So, in terms of medicine, as I alluded to before, well, actually, he was more of an intellectual. So, although he was supreme physician or court physician, it's called, he wasn't actually cutting a lot of bodies open and doing a lot of practice. He was doing more theoretical work, sort of not getting his hands too dirty. Kind of the royal physician. He was a big supporter of Galen's four humors. So as I mentioned before, there's the blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, and they're also associated with like character traits. And basically, you have to balance these four different humors. He observed that the retina is that part of the eye that observes light, and he has his quote here. The innermost of the coats of the eye, the retina, must necessarily receive light from the humors of the eye, the lens, just like the humors receive the light from air. So, some have disputed this, but, you know, I assume it's true. Stroke, he observed strokes, and he saw that this was an obstruction of the artery giving blood to the brain. So what I think from this is that he must have seen inside of a body and been familiar with veins and capillaries, so it wasn't necessarily right. That's not what causes a stroke, but it is kind of more of a part. It's a big part of a stroke, but he didn't fully diagnose it. He also observed symptoms of Parkinson's, but he never got a name. He never named it. So, but it would have been cool if we had Averroes' disease today, but I don't think he would have liked to have it named after him anyways. So yeah, in terms of his legacy, he's been included in the Divine Comedy, which is, like, I would say, being on the all-star team for philosophy. He's making a Divine Comedy, you did it. He was also featured in Canterbury Tales, which is one of the oldest books in English, the English language. I think the oldest actually, I guess, Beowulf, but if you even consider that English, but also great achievement there. He's included in paintings by Raphael here. And obviously huge influence on Western and Eastern philosophy, but I think what's most important is what's in between them. I think he brought them together. I think he made the Islam more comfortable with, or the Islamic world more comfortable with Western philosophy, but I think he also made Western philosophy more comfortable with Islamic thinkers. So I think he was good and very important in that regards. Here's a painting. I'll talk about it now because it's also on the other slide too, but here's a picture of Thomas Aquinas stepping on Averroes, because they had a couple disputes, as we'll outline soon, and Aristotle and Plato on each side of him. I think this is just a horrible painting for a couple reasons. Firstly, I don't think Thomas Aquinas would ever step on him, even though they disagreed. I think it's shameful to put Averroes on the floor. But secondly, Averroes was a huge fan of Aristotle, and he supported everything Aristotle said. Aristotle, I think, would be jumping in and helping, giving him a hand up. So I think it's just, yeah, it's just, people say that there's a lot of hate today. Things have always been hateful. Like, this is, yeah, it's sad that they made that. But nonetheless, we'll continue on to Thomas Aquinas, and we'll talk a little bit more about Averroes in the comparison. So Thomas Aquinas was an Italian Dominican friar, so philosopher, Catholic priest, and doctor of a church. Ultimately, he becomes saint, gets canonized, Saint Thomas Aquinas. He's known for his scholasticism as a Doctor Angelicus and Doctor Communis. His origins in Aquino, that's where he gets his name, Aquinas, which is in modern-day Lazio, Italy. He's number one classical proponent of natural theology, founder of Thomism, which is based on his name as usual, which is based on the presupposition that all reason is based on God, but we'll get into that very soon. In terms of literature, he's got disputed questions on truth, Summa contra gentiles, and Summa theological, which is unfinished, and we'll talk a little bit more of that, but also many other works as well. He's got famous hymns as well, which you can look up on YouTube, and I'll tell you about those in a bit. And yeah, I guess it's best to just start off in the beginning, at his early life. So he was born in a castle of Roccasecca in the kingdom of Sicily, in Aquino, modern-day Lazio, Italy. The castle of Roccasecca was his father's castle. His father is Landelf of Aquino, I suppose. They were a very powerful family, but his specific part was not the most powerful sect of the family, or powerful branch of the family. So this is a kind of a, I don't think it's really talked about being close to power. For some people, it could be worse than being when you're so far out of reach that it doesn't taunt you. But he was probably surrounded a lot by people who are more powerful. So I just think it's an interesting dynamic that isn't really addressed too much. So he was one of the younger sons, so his the elder brothers were sent off to military school, but very common for a younger son to be sent off to become an abbot. So he gets sent off at 5 years old to Monte Cassino, which is school to get ready to be an abbot. But there's an military conflict between the Emperor Frederick II and Pope Gregory IX, and the fight spilled into the abbey, and the parents said they got to pull him out of the school and brought him to Stadium Generale, which was recently established by Frederick. So what we can conclude here is that the family was more partial towards Frederick than they were to the Pope, which, interestingly enough, I think if Aquinas were in their situation, he would have been more partial towards the Pope than he were to the Frederick II. Here he studied Aristotle. This is where he first read about Averroes as well, who he contradicted, and Maimonides. He studied arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music under Petrus of Iberia. He meets this Dominican preacher from Naples, and he decides that at 19 he wants to join the Dominican Order. His parents are displeased because, firstly, I don't think they were very partial to religion. They just kind of wanted to give him a career, but also he had to dedicate his life to celibacy, which is obviously not something most parents would want. So he tries to flee to Rome, so he's like, I'm just going to do this. He tries running away at 19, but he gets captured on the way down, and while he's drinking at a spring, they capture him and bring him into their castle. So I know you might think if your parents are still alive, which or your parents were harsh, or you might think other people's parents are harsh. Well, this guy had it tough. He's imprisoned in his own house. But the Pope supposedly was considering trying to free him, but he thought it would cause too much political issues. His two brothers tried to seduce a prostitute to actually go into his room and get him to give up his vows to celibacy, but apparently he chased her off with a fire iron. And while he was sleeping, two angels that night appeared while he slept and told him to remain celibate. So that was it. He decided he was never going to never going to break his vows, and he was dedicated to join the Dominican Order. Eventually, Theodora, his mother, decides that it's better to let him escape than to ultimately give him up. So she knew her son was never going to change, so it's like it's either eventually he gets broken out and then it's just shameful to the family, or they just let him run away. So she lets him sneak out eventually, and he runs off to Rome to meet Johann von Wildeshausen, who is a Master General of the Dominican Order, and he studies under him for a little bit, and then he goes to the University of Paris and into the Faculty of Arts, like an undergraduate degree. So we're starting to see here now, we're getting closer to modernity, is that the sort of educational system is getting very much similar to ours. It's about a similar age that one might be to do an undergraduate degree, and a similar university style. Under Pope Innocent IV, an abbot, gives him an abbot appointment in Monte Cassino as a Dominican abbot. So Monte Cassino was the place where at 5 years old he first tried going to school. So he finally gets this role he'd been wanting since he was 5, but he refuses, and he chooses to follow this individual named Albertus Magnus to Stadium General in Cologne. So I guess now is a good time to mention the Albertus Magnus quote. So while he was a student, he was kind of slow. He wasn't very outspoken. They thought he was dumb. But here's a quote: "You call him the dumb ox, but in his teachings he will one day produce such a bellowing that it will be heard throughout the world." So this guy had confidence with him, and vice versa, because Thomas Aquinas decides to follow him off to Cologne. He is an apprentice professor in Cologne, and he studies the Old Testament here. So it sort of gives him a rounded perspective of the religion. And he also even writes commentaries on the Old Testament, commentary on Isaiah, commentary on Jeremiah, and on Lamentations. He also starts giving public debates. So I think that is public debate. I think is like the highest form of intellect. If you can lecture, that's good. But if you can debate, that's better. It shows a higher demonstration of the knowledge. And then do it in public. It also shows oratory skills. So very impressive. And once again, very necessary at the time. He ultimately, after that, gets a master's degree in Paris in theology and becomes a regent master of theology, which is like pretty much the top role. So he had done it. He had sort of mastered the career, or academic career. So after his first regency, he leaves to Naples. It said that he left this regency because he wanted to allow others to gain education. I think he probably had a more selfish reason, but maybe he's a saint. Maybe he did really leave just because he wanted to help other people. Personally, I think he probably just wanted to keep traveling. This guy was a prolific traveler, and he couldn't seem to sit still. And he sort of serves just there as a general preacher. He gets this role as Orvietesto, called to become Orvietesto, which is a conventual lector. And this is where he completes Summa Contra Gentiles, the Golden Chain. At this point, Pope Urban IV also commissions him to write some hymns, and he writes the hymns for Corpus Christi specifically, such as Pang Lingua and Panis Angelicus. So you can literally look this up on YouTube today and just type in Thomas Aquinas Corpus Christi hymns. I'm not saying you might necessarily like it. It's a bit old. I don't know if you will. I hope you will. I think that would be not very nice. I don't know if you will connect to it because you're not necessarily in the same emotional state as he. But it's cool that even now as I'm speaking, you're thinking about this person and sort of feeling his life. To listen to music, you'll literally be listening to the heartbeat and the tonality that he was feeling. So I think that's a really cool thing to experience. So 5 years later, he goes to Rome for Pope Clement IV, who summoned him to become a papal theologian. So, and he also, another reason he goes there is he wants to start a Dominican chapter of Agnani by the Stadium Conventual. So at the time, Roman schools were actually very basic. They were theological schools, but they didn't cover other categories. So he creates a school Roman convent called Santa Sabina, where it also included moral and natural philosophy as well, so sort of expanding it beyond just theology. So I think this is what made him so successful beyond other theological thinkers at the time, was that he was passionate about many different things, and he sort of brought philosophy, brought Aristotle and that into his teachings. It's also at this time he wrote his most famous work called Summa Theology. So he's got this quote about it: because a doctor of Catholic truth ought not only to teach the proficient, but to him pertains also to instruct beginners. So I think that's a really beautiful thing, in that, you know, some of the smartest people in the world are not teaching the beginners, and I think that's kind of an obligation that they have, and I think that it showed a lot of forethought and a lot of benevolence that Thomas Aquinas was willing to do this, because he could have really spent the rest of his days just speaking to the top guys and never conversing with beginners, but he wrote this book explicitly for them, which I think is very benevolent. Then he returns to Paris in 1268 for his second teaching regency. So with that, Santa Sabina, the school that he was starting back in Rome, it actually has a section specifically for women, so kind of like Averroes. He was very respectful to women at the time. It eventually became called the Pontifex University of St. Thomas Aquinas Angelica, so it's actually still there today, Papal University, or Pontifical University. So yeah, nice influence there. So, but at this time there was a rise in Averroism and radical Aristotelianism. So this is Averroes' ideas were really starting to hit steam at this point. But he thought that Thomas Aquinas really didn't like this philosophy. He thought that he didn't like the beginninglessness of the world that Averroes presented. He presented Averroes with a lot of slander, saying he was blind leading the blind. So obviously not a very strong supporter of Averroes there. So he goes to Naples following that, because he's told he can start a Dominican institution wherever, and in 1972 becomes a regent master there, preaches at Lent, and around this time in Naples, or just around this time generally, because he also preached in Lent, he supposedly has two miracles. Firstly, he levitates during just a speech he's doing. He starts to levitate, and supposedly he hears from God. He says, "You have written well of me, Thomas. What reward would you have for your labor?" And he responds, "Nothing but you, Lord." So supposedly there was something else that happened after here, but it was not written, and he did not speak of it. But that was the first miracle. The second miracle, he was writing some theological, or a piece of writing, and he just immediately stopped. And a lot of people thought that this was a miracle. God had told him to change his mind. I think that one, I have a hard time believing that that's a miracle, but obviously it takes place in the context, in what's called there's a devil's advocate when canonizing a person, when deciding whether or not someone should become a saint. There's what's called a devil's advocate. So they said that there were disputed whether or not these things were actually miracles. So he said the argument against the devil's advocate was that there are as many miracles in his life as articles in his writing. So I like that, because it pretty much says that, his writing were the miracles, and the levitation and him changing his ideas were really secondary. Eventually there's sort of what's called a great schism between the West, the Pope, and Eastern Orthodox, in terms of the Christianity. So he gets sent back to Rome after he did his miracles to sort of try solving this. And he gets hit on the head on the Appian Way. So the Appian Way is actually the entrance to Rome. It's where the gladiators in the War of Spartacus were crucified all along the Appian Way. But nowadays it's just, you won't see any trees there. But Thomas Aquinas was hit by a branch, and he got ill and ultimately died from this. So yeah, I think it's pretty unfortunate way to die. But his final quote was, "I have written and taught much about this very holy body, and about the other sacraments in the faith of Christ, and about the Holy Roman Church, to whose correction I expose and submit everything I have written." So basically he says that, here's everything I wrote. If something's wrong, you guys have the right to expose it and tear it apart. So very, very humble final lines. In Divine Comedy by Dante, he actually presupposes that he was poisoned, but there's nothing backed up by this in terms of fact. So time to move on to the more complex part, the philosophy. So firstly, I'd like to mention that he actually criticized philosophers. He thought they fell short of the true and proper wisdom which could be found in the Christian revelation. So he thought that theologians or religious intellectuals were superior to philosophers, but nonetheless, he still supported some. He had sort of his philosophy is considered a modified version of Aristotelianism, Neoplatonism, with a reliance on pseudo-Dionysus, which is sort of like an approach to understanding God, but through a negative, using negative arguments as opposed to positive arguments. So basically saying like God is not this, rather than saying God is this, not like negative in terms of happy and like sad. So in terms of epistemology, this is always a different one. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. So he takes a very different stance. So some say, nothing, what can we believe in? He says that knowledge of any truth whatsoever, man needs divine help. That the intelligent may be moved by God to all its end. So the intellect may be moved all by God to its end. So basically he's saying that all wisdom is only through God, which is very different from anything we have seen previously. Some say, you cannot rely on your senses. Some say you can only rely on your senses. He says you can only rely on God. So his example here, he uses draws a analogy to water won't boil without heat. So everything has a cause. And I guess if you keep going down the line to the first principle or the first cause, and the first cause in his argument is God. So therefore, contingent, as we mentioned in Avicenna, he thought there was, that there's the contingent existence. So for example, humans are contingent. We exist because of this, because of this, because of this. So with that, I guess Thomas Aquinas' concept of knowledge makes sense. In terms of ethics, he believed in what's called the first principles of action. So I guess to start, he thought there were 4 types of laws. There's the eternal law, there's natural law, and then there's human law, and there's divine law. So to start from the bottom, divine law is that which is dictated in Scripture, which is, like, for example, in the Old Testament, like the 10 Commandments or whatever's written in Scripture. Then there's human, which are like the laws that are given by the state. Then there's natural law, and this is what he calls the first principles of action. So he says, virtue denotes a certain perfection of power. Now with things, perfection is considered chiefly in regard to its end, but the end of power is act. Wherefore power is said to be perfect according as it is determinate to its act. So basically, anything that's in your power should be done. So that would be the natural. And this actually justifies slavery. And actually, Aristotle was pro-slavery as well. But Thomas Aquinas is not pro-slavery. But this is like an Aristotelian argument. And Aristotle was also a racist too, and that as well. But this natural law is contradictory to human law and divine law and eternal law. So so Thomas Aquinas obviously didn't support slavery, but that was just one type of law, and that's the first principles of action. He saw the theological virtues, which are faith, hope, and clarity. Perfect virtue includes charity, and only Christians can properly do charity, supposedly. And then there's the 4 cardinal virtues, which are prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. In terms of how this led into economic thought, he came up with the concept of a just price, and a price sufficient to cover costs. So this is pretty profound thought, considering this guy did not have any business background. I don't think he ever really was scrambling for paychecks. He came from a pretty wealthy family. The worst thing that ever happened to him was he got forced to stay in his castle, his own family castle. So it's interesting that he was saw what it meant for people to get cheated financially and that sort, and came up with this concept of just price, but also unjustness in gouging. Similarly, he also talked about intrinsic value, such as, and he used the example of gold and silver. Not only is it used as a medium of exchange, it's also just got beauty, which is a very even a lot of people who study finance do not understand how to price intrinsic value. But obviously, Thomas Aquinas did not have a way of pricing it. But in terms of politics, he saw that there was a difference between a good man and a good citizen. So this kind of sort of alludes to the coming of liberalism and individual autonomy. So he thought that, just because you're not a good citizen doesn't mean you're not a good man. The state could be wrong. He believed that monarchy was the best government because as long as you curb their political power, they're not compromising their needs because they've already got all the power. They don't need to cheat people or do anything of that sort. He also thought that oligarchies had a tendency to fall into tyranny. So for example, there are 5 oligarchs. It's very likely that one might, try to get more power than they were originally given. And also, but another interesting one that I disagree with is he thought, unless everyone consents, the tyrant stays. Otherwise, the monarchy will fall into anarchy. So this is all very explicitly written, actually, in Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. So he believed that if you need a monarch with absolute authority, otherwise you'll people have have an insatiable greed, and unless someone is just given it all, everyone's just going to continually fight and we'll just all fall into tyranny eventually. But unless, what Thomas Aquinas is saying here, unless everyone consents, the tyrant stays. I think a simple majority is fine, but that's just, I think if he heard of that, like 60%, 70%, yeah, sure, 70% of people want to get rid of the government, sure, get rid of them. I think that's sufficient. I don't think it has to be every single person. But he also thought that the leader should be God's representative, but the church should be above this individual in terms of doctrines of morality. So, but some sort of divine right of kings. So Hobbes also alluded to this. Averroes alluded to this as well. It's slightly beyond what Plato devised in his Republic as the philosopher king. In terms of psychology, he thought that the human body is comprised of body and soul, but they're inseparable. And so, for example, a dead body is not a human because it has no soul. So matter and form are inseparable. And soul is in all parts of the body. It's not just in your brain. It's in everything. It's in every cell. Also, lastly, in terms of economics, he thought that usury, which is giving a loan without interest, was a sin. So an individual famous for this would be Crassus, who was considered the richest man in Rome. He would give these loans, and at the end, they would have to pay a bullet payment with no interest, but it essentially caused them to put them into slavery, or he had essentially complete control over them, over their wishes. So he thought that was sinful. The nature of God, he thought that God's existence was self-evident in itself, but not to us. And he had 5 ways of proving this. So the first way is that motion exists without cause. So, for example, gravity. He thought, observe gravity, therefore there must be God. There's no cause for it. There's got to be a first mover, a first cause. That's something we saw very clearly in the Al-Farabi and Avicenna video. There's got to be a first cause. He thought that not everything can be unnecessary. There has to be something that is necessary. And there's gradation. So there's things get hotter. Those things get better. So there has to be an absolute, things can't get better infinitely. There's got to be an absolute, which is the God. And lastly, there's a tendency. So everything sort of has a tendency, and he thought that had to be the fifth and final proof of the existence of God. He thought, similar to Averroes, he thought that God had specific qualities, in that he is simple, perfect, infinite, immortal, and one. So I find it interesting that he uses both the qualities infinite and one, pretty much almost right next to each other. So they're pretty much almost opposites. I guess the opposite of infinite is zero, so close. But I think it's interesting that he did both, because we had lots of individuals who said infinite, lots of individuals who said one, but never actually say both simultaneously. In terms of theology, so this is probably the most difficult one to address, specifically in terms of Thomas. So he's thought as more of a science than perhaps more of his contemporaries, particularly more than the non-theological thinkers, but more than theological thinkers. He believed that God reveals himself through nature, so to study nature is to study God. Grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it. So nature is the tendency of God, essentially. Revelation, so a revelation, truth can come through reason, which is natural revelation, or faith, which is a supernatural revelation. And the only way to do this is through tradition, or to deduce the history through Jesus Christ. In terms of creation, he thought that God created heaven and earth, but like Aristotle, he also believed that in sort of evolution, he thought that people could come from plants, or life could, he observed that life was alive, but life could come from non-living things as well. So this is alluding to evolution, and this is something that I think at least many individuals in the Catholic Church would have problems with at the time, and even going forward. Also, Empedocles noted that there could be deviations in. He originally observed it with a mule. If you breed a donkey and a horse, it makes a mule, which can't breed. But he thought that, for example, if something, firstly, actually, he believed that it came specifically from the sperm, always from the sperm. So now we know that what a mutation is just a failure in copying of 2 DNA and create something bad. And we even see it in cancers as well. But it doesn't just come from the sperm, so that was obviously not correct. But he thought that, for example, if something mutated, it did not have the right to live, it just did not have the right for perpetual existence. And I think this applies specifically to the mule. Like, the mule is not morally useless. Like, if you kill a mule, you're still killing something. It just can't breed, doesn't have a right to perpetual existence. So that's what he meant by there. Going back to just war, so we've talked about this quite a bit recently. So Augustine said, not brawling does not count, and he did not tackle the concept of what is unjust or just war. He just thought that all war was just. So Thomas goes to lengths to expand on this. He said, firstly, it needs to have these 3 characteristics. It must be for a good purpose, so it can't be a war for wealth or for solely power, and it must be waged properly and instituted by a state. So it's if you want to go fight another soccer team or football team, that's not war, that's not just. And also peace must be the central motive, so you must be fighting to try to stop the fighting. That's not paradoxical. The school of Salamanca, which was 20 years later, expanded on this just war to also include that war could be just in terms of self-defense, as a preventative measure, in terms of, for example, first strike, you're about to be attacked, attack first to get the upper hand, or lastly, for punitary reasons. But these are things that Thomas ultimately neglected. So his concept of Jesus Christ is pretty much literal, exactly as it reads in the religious text. He thought that he was God, essentially. He had components of God, and he did die to redeem the original sin. So I think I take up personally right now I have a little less literal stance. I don't think Jesus was God, but I do think he was a real person, and I think he did something that I think you could call godly, in that he did a very inspiring act that I think is a great story to tell, and everyone should read about it because it was something that was really great and really inspiring. So that's my perspective on that. But he believed that he was literally God coming down. In terms of heretics, he thinks that heretics should be put to death. If a heretic repents, that's okay, but if they repent, they should die. He thought that if you do not believe in God, you have no intrinsic right to life. But contrary to that, he was actually very tolerant to Jews. And he actually argued for their inclusion. So I think this might be because one of the first texts that he read was the Old Testament. So I think that's nice. So I guess it's okay if you believe something different, but if you don't believe anything at all, to death with you. In terms of magic and miracles, he thought only God could create miracles. Even angels and demons, what they create is not miracles, because what they create is from natural things. So even witchcraft, which was actually a growing trend at this time, he thought, those aren't miracles. Those are just miracles, and they're just changing of substances. Some apothecary. But that's why. But his miracle, for example, his levitation, that was a real miracle, because that was God. He actually had a dialogue with God. In terms of the afterlife, so the body comes up and supposedly goes to a heaven, and it compensates for life's struggles. And this is consistent pretty much with the literal reading of the Bible. And this is also consistent with his belief that the soul and the body were inseparable. So if just the soul were to go up, then you would not be going up. So he thought that your whole body goes up. So obviously he's got a huge influence in terms of and legacy. But he's criticized by, for example, Bertrand Russell. It's that he would write things and then after try to explain them. But I think that argument could be used for anyone, and I don't think that's too fairly grounded. And his arguments for virtue and ethics can be seen as counter-arguments for utilitarianism and Kantian sense of duty. But obviously his influence is greatest in terms of the Christianity, and not only just directly that, I think it also has a big ripple effect. I think he was a very good person, and whether people know it or not, I think just having more good people is just ripple effects. So I think his positivity had a ripple effect through, I would say, everyone. So yeah, I guess in terms of the comparison, I guess I'll talk about the quotes. I'll make sure I didn't miss any of the quotes here. Just the quote on Averroes that I missed: ignorance leads to fear, fear leads to hate, and hate leads to violence. I think it's self-explanatory. And knowledge is the conformity of the object and the intellect. We discussed that. So that's, and yeah, going back to Thomas Aquinas. Yeah, this one's my favorite, in that because a doctor of the Catholic truth ought not to teach only proficient, but to him pertains also to instruct the beginners. And here's I think that's great. But here's the shield of the Dominican Order. It's pretty cool. And here's another image. This is Thomas Aquinas stepping on Averroes. I think this is an absolutely sick painting. I can't believe Aristotle would be standing there. Even Plato would be jumping in there too. And Thomas Aquinas, the saint, would never do so. Maybe he's actually levitating on top of him, and they're actually just having a good time. But this is a horrible painting. Yeah. So in terms of the comparison, so I think firstly, Averroes was more interested in philosophy than he was in religion, whereas Thomas Aquinas thought that religious people were superior to philosophers, so kind of inverted in that regard. So that would be the first contrast. In terms of a comparison, I think they were both very important in synergizing both philosophy and religion, but also in terms of synergizing, well, actually, I think Averroes is better in that he was more synergizing in between the West and the East, whereas Thomas Aquinas might have been a little bit more divisive when he contested or argued against Averroes. He could have been creating a little bit of division. Another similarity is their perspective on women. They were both had a very positive treatment and perspective and outlook for females. So yeah, that is Averroes and Thomas Aquinas. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I hope you watch some of the ones I've made in the past, and I hope that maybe you might have been inspired by this, and I hope maybe just for a second you might have stepped in their shoes, or maybe their absence of shoes for a second. So thanks so much.